Direct Healing by Paul Ellsworth, Chapter 5. Healing Others. Hardly second to the cry of self-healing comes that for the means and methods of healing others. Christ healed the sick, and the love and unselfishness of the Christ Spirit in his followers longs to do the work that he did. But how? Sometimes the most satisfactory way of telling a man how to do a particular thing is to tell him how not to do it. And following somewhat the same reasoning, I am going to speak first of the principal difficulty in healing others, extrinsic healing, which does not appear in self-healing. The root of this difficulty can be indicated in a few words: the right of self-government. Until your friend desires at least to try to be healed by spiritual methods, it will be impossible for you to do much for him. Frankly, I do not believe it is advisable to try to force healing upon anyone or to treat any individual without his or her knowledge. We will suppose, however, that you desire to heal a friend who knows of your intention and is willing to cooperate with you. What can you do? Well, you can do nothing of yourself. It must be first, last, and all the time the Christ Spirit working in and through you that does the work. And this Christ Spirit will work principally by the process of education. In a very real sense, all healing is self-healing, but this does not mean that you can do nothing. It simply means that you are to be the channel through which the regenerating wisdom reaches your friend. Sickness results from a lack of righteous adjustment, and with your help, the sufferer must learn to readjust the activities of his mind and body. Before going farther, it will perhaps be well to answer an objection which is certain to occur to some of my readers. Christ healed the sick, I am told. He didn't give them lessons in right thinking, he said. Thy faith hath made thee whole, and it was so. It is impossible for the partial to comprehend the complete, and we cannot analyze all of the Christ's actions and reach the motives back of them. But in this case, a little thought will show that his mission was rather that of a teacher, a sower of the seed of a new way of thinking and living, than a reformer of individual men. Even his disciples were to serve principally as the husk of his spiritual germ, which he was planting. None of them attained to anything of the spiritual perfection of the Master. But in those who came to Jesus for healing, he recognized nascent faith aroused by suffering and desire. The man who is whole in body and pocketbook usually considers himself amply able to look out for himself without anything more than a formal assistance from his religion. But let sickness strike him down, or financial reverses come, and he begins to cry for light, for healing. So in those who came to Jesus for help, he found that condition of openness which he needed for planting the truth. His time was limited and his work broad, and he could not do more than plant the seed, but he always did this, for with his healing he gave them warning. Go and sin no more. Sin, or lack of adjustment, was intimately connected with the evil state of the sufferer. When next he came into tribulation, as he surely must come, he could hardly avoid thinking of this intimate connection which the Christ had forced upon his attention. The Nazarene was a world teacher. He dwelt with masses of men, and the individuals whom he trained personally were merely the leaven for carrying his teachings to the nations. Healing was incidental, but he never made it a positive hindrance to the growth of the one he healed, as he would have done had he simply removed the physical symptoms without calling attention to the spiritual cause. Intrinsic healing, even when it seems to occur, merely helps men to cheat themselves into the belief that they can beat the game, that they can obtain the fruits of righteousness without its regenerate living. And when it occurs, it is brought about by forces outside of the sufferer's understanding, outside of himself, and is therefore accidental. The man who takes medicine for stomach trouble may be helped, apparently at first, but the time will come when the same remedy will only aggravate his misery. He has not dealt with the cause, and he cannot be sure of repeating the results. So much for the negative side of healing others. The first positive step is in the direction of reviewing the theory of spiritual healing, both for your own encouragement and for that of your patient. Spiritual healing is not local or partial, but complete. That is, it depends for its efficacy upon a realization, a making real of that truth in regard to the constitution of man, which frees him from all limitations. It depends upon the eternal fact that each human being is a child of the Spirit and is potentially perfect. Apparent imperfection in any form comes from leading an unbalanced life, usually one in which physical phenomena are allowed to usurp the attention. Healing, or a return to the perfection which is normal, does not have to be forced. It follows naturally and inevitably when the proper balance of spiritual and physical is restored. And this restoration depends upon choice. It can be accomplished as soon as the individual is willing to return to the Father consciousness, from which also, through choice, it has separated itself. This return is accomplished through a serene and persistent beholding of the truth. As the molecules of iron are permeated by the radiations from an electromagnet and are so changed in their rate and manner of vibration that they, too, possess magnetism, as this is accomplished simply by bringing the iron near the magnet and leaving it there for a time. So the human consciousness, which brings itself to the consideration of spiritual truth, is regenerated until it, too, becomes spiritual, with the all-perfection and all potencies of spirit. The iron does not make itself magnetic. It possesses an inherent capacity for magnetism, and by being brought into contact with magnetic vibrations, it is changed without effort, naturally and unfailingly. For your spiritual magnet, take the statement, "I am the resurrection and the life," or "I and the Father are one." With your physical senses stilled and your body at ease, repeat your formulation of truth again and again, slowly, pausing to consider all that it connotes or carries with it. I and the Father are one. This is potentially true and becomes positively and dynamically so just as soon as you accept it and begin to live it. You, the real inner you, are the one with the Father's Spirit, which permeates all things. You can be less than this only by conscious or unconscious choice. And being one or identical with the Father, you are perfect, serene, dynamic, with the broad and impersonal compassion which goes forth freely and fearlessly to every living creature. You are wisdom and power and love incarnate. And again, you can be less than this only by choice, conscious or unconscious. You are potentially complete, perfect, but you can for a time put the emphasis on a part of yourself and so manifest distortion of one part or another, poverty, sickness, unhappiness. But all the time, you and the Father are one, and no matter where you are or what your condition seems to be, you can at any moment turn from the partial to the complete. You don't need to fight the symptoms of inharmony, but simply to accept and manifest that wholeness and perfection which is eternally yours. If you desire to come under the spiritual law, which perfects the physical shadow, simply turn your attention from the external world to the inner chamber of the consciousness, where the Father abides, although in your flurry and bluster you have not been conscious of his indwelling, and give yourself serenely and lovingly to the consideration of the truth. I and the Father are one. I am the resurrection and the life. Don't bother about symptoms. If you make the cause right, the effect must follow in good time. This is absolute and inevitable. Remember, a symptom or physical manifestation is simply the showing forth of a spiritual condition or cause, and you can absolutely control this manifestation by making perfect the cause, or by realizing its perfection and allying yourself, your conscious effort, desire, and attention with it. After you have made this adjustment in consciousness, you can and should ignore symptoms. Sincerely deny that they are good, bad, or indifferent. They are nothing but shadows, and you are now living in harmony with the cause, the reality back of them. I and the Father are one. If the friend whom you are treating is new to new thought, do not, to begin with, go farther than this treatment for the realization of unity with the Father. Direct control by the will of the subconscious life in the tissues must come later. It can be successfully established only on a foundation of self-recognition. Until the seeker after truth begins to glimpse in a practical, usable way his or her real nature as a child of God, any attempt at this direct control is certain to be made from a standpoint of an external attempt to influence an internal and capricious and mysterious force called vitality. So in the beginning, at any rate, you will do well to confine your own and your friends' attention to the great underlying principle upon which all enduring accomplishment is founded. Remember that simply this realization of unity with God has cured all of the so-called incurable diseases. But it means a complete break with the old ways of thinking and with many of the old ways of living, and it cannot be fully established in a moment. In this ministry of healing, you are but the channel for the life of God. Remember this always. If in your earnest and unselfish desire to be of assistance, you allow your connection with the central powerhouse to be broken, if you strive to become something in yourself, you will fail. Severed from me, ye can do nothing. And so, as the first requisites for your equipment as a healer, you will need a humble spirit, constant openness to the light, and absolute unselfishness. In this latter detail, the nature of your task will help you. You are seeking nothing for yourself, and you will not need to worry about your motives. But what are you to do? In the first place, you are to help your friend to grasp the working principles of spiritual healing, as we have considered them. Next, you are to help him find those points of conflict and friction in his manner of thinking or living which have externalized as disease. Perhaps this conflict lies in the manner of personal rights or even righteous indignation at some of the evils of society or of the people about him. Help him to see that these things are in God's keeping and that the most practical reform he can influence is to reform his way of thinking, to learn to be humble and tolerant and kindly, even toward the sot in the gutter, and help him to realize that the old theological pity, which looked upon all who did not measure up to its little foot rule of sinlessness as billed straight through to a hell of sizzling brimstone, will not answer here. He must learn to see in the drunkard his own vices masquerading under a different guise. I have known as many beefsteak drunks and as many bread and butter and potato fiends as I have alcoholics or drug fiends. And I am stating that very moderately. Toleration and sympathy, the earnest, humble, kindly desire to help others out of the same bog of sensualism and ignorance in which we have wallowed. Your patient will not get far until he learns this lesson. But whatever his basic errors, you must hold yourself so open to the light of God's wisdom that you will glimpse these unmistakably. And you must farther claim your birthright of wisdom in the matter of speaking out. For it is not always best to call your friend's attention to his shortcomings. Sometimes he will need to gain spiritual perspective, to deal with the constructive side of spiritual healing for a time, before he has his attention turned toward these hindrances to his farther advance. And don't forget, in the meantime, to practice that toleration to which you are going to help him attain. Look upon his shortcomings as those of a child in the kindergarten. Sin is always the result of a lack of wisdom. And when you do feel that the time has come to speak frankly, do it without any assumption of self-righteousness. The I am better than thou spirit always antagonizes its recipient. Be kindly and simple, and don't argue. If your friend does not see the matter as you do, if he thinks you are mistaking a virtue for a vice, simply remind him of the way in which he must settle everything that comes into his life by going direct to the Spirit for understanding and persisting until he receives it. Probably your greatest opportunity for serving will be in the matter of steadfast and unwavering faith. When the times of discouragement come, when perhaps everything which has been gained seems to be swept away, explain the law of rhythm, of high and low tides in all life and energy. Now is the time to use dogmatic faith. Don't try to advance, but stick doggedly, if necessary, to your ground. And you, whom your position on the outside of the turmoil places at an advantage, you must be the main anchor at this time, if at no other. Stick serene and unwavering to your ideal. You are to help not by tears and sympathy with imperfection, but by that radiant faith which turns neither to the right hand nor to the left, but which beholds through all the mists and fogs the perfection established by the Father for each of his children. God wills it. Make that your watchword and stick. And remember always to make your own spiritual life all that it should be. Read for inspiration for the purpose of keying yourself up to the spiritual vibrations, and pray, not the prayer of supplication and separation, but the prayer of thanksgiving, of joyous acceptance of the Christ life which is yours. What shall you do when your friends backslide? Do nothing. Realize the truth that there is no permanent going back. In one of the Oriental Bibles, I can remember reading that when the soul has once turned toward the path of seeking, it can never go back to the old way of living and stay there. It may seem to have done so, but suddenly, swiftly, with terrible unexpectedness sometimes, it will be torn from its moorings in the carnal world and turned back toward the light. And this is an absolute fact you will soon discover. The early history of many an exalted career is marked by reactions, but when the soul has tasted the fruits of righteousness, however meagerly, it can never go back permanently to the husks of the flesh. So don't worry about backsliders. Insist on seeing them always as you know them to be, intrinsically perfect and righteous, and let the Spirit do the rest. Sometimes you will be asked to decide what your patient shall eat, or whether he shall continue to take medicine. It is usually best not to decide these things for anyone. Teach the inquirer that they are negative, that as long as he has faith in the efficacy of medicine, the mere doing without it is nothing. Tell him to use it if he cares to, but not to let that hinder him from doing the positive things. If he will go forward in the life of the Spirit, medicine will soon take care of itself. He will learn to discard the symbol and to choose the reality which lies beyond it. In the matter of healing children, you will find that you have not to deal with the same conditions and limitations which confronted you in healing grown people or in helping them to heal themselves. Right in the beginning, you will almost invariably find near the little invalid one or more mature people who are responsible, very innocently, of course, for his condition. Children are 100 times more sensitive to the thought forces of those about them than are adults. And the more highly organized a child is, the more easily he is affected by the tantrums, the false beliefs, the nerves of his elders. And so before you can do much with the child, you must do something for his parents. If possible, get them to cooperate with you both in the matter of direct healing and also in that important matter of healing their own imperfections. Sometimes you will have to deal with one or another parent who is more or less frankly skeptical about spiritual healing. Don't argue, but if this individual is at all open to reason, give him or her a little lecture on the effects of the emotions as evidenced in everyday life. The sick feeling in the stomach during grief or extreme excitement, the flushed face of rage, etc. Then call attention to the greater sensitiveness of children. These things are not at all mystical, and along this line you can often secure at least a negative cooperation. Sometimes your best obstacle will be a parent who believes implicitly in the principles of spiritual healing, but who is so lacking in self-control that he or she cannot cease scolding, nagging, worrying, or whatever his or her mental taint is. The only available measure in such cases is to ask this carrier of mental infection to stay away from the child as much as possible and to get down to business in his or her own soul garden. The noxious weeds growing there will occasion much suffering if they are not rooted up. After you have attended to these basic details, explain directly to the little patient just what you intend to do. Explain that God gave him a perfect little body, that God is his Father, always close to him and trying to keep him strong and well. Then explain how the clouds have drifted between him and God, and how he must for a while talk through the clouds and tell God just what he wants, and that when he has done this, he must remember that God hears in spite of the clouds, and that from this moment on, his loving Father is building him a new little body, strong and perfect in every part. Faith is a natural attribute of children, even where it seems to have been buried under a mass of false teaching. It can be swiftly reached and made effective. And the prayers of children are as dear to God as they were to the Nazarene. Your third step will lie in cooperating directly with the child and its parents in forming a dynamic ideal, a spiritual pattern of the child as you desire him to appear. Remember that this is also God's ideal, that nothing short of perfection satisfies him in any of his children. And when you have agreed on this ideal, refuse longer to consider physical appearances. Remember that the life force which built the little body is still in it, and that it is natural and easy for it to build perfectly, and that by doing away with negative thinking and substituting for it the dynamic and constructive faith in spirit, you are fulfilling every requirement. Here is a prayer which you can use with or without modification as circumstances suggest. Dear Father, we thank Thee that this Thy little child is perfect in every cell and fiber, in every organ and tissue. We thank Thee that even now Thy regenerating life permeates him and rebuilds him and perfects him in structure and function. And we thank Thee for Thy infinite love which fills and perfects all of us, which casts out all fear and makes us to realize every instant that Thy healing is perfect and complete. Jesus' love for little children indicates something of their unique value in the kingdom. If they are voyagers newly embarked on the ocean of objective living, after a sojourn in the rest of unconsciousness, if they have lived before and shall live again, as those who accept the doctrine of reincarnation believe, then we can perceive that they are at least in a more receptive condition during this morning of each new voyage than they are later in its course. That is both their weakness and their strength, for if they are prone to absorb the evil influences of the more mature minds about them, they are also easily affected for good by the same minds. Children do not resist spiritual treatment as mature people often unconsciously do, and the sins which affect them are oftenest those of their elders. This makes healing in the case of little children particularly direct and certain, And remember that it is never God's will for any of these little ones to be sick. End of chapter 5 of Direct Healing by Paul Ellsworth.